Hello, and welcome to another episode of Kings of History, a podcast where we will talk about all the kings of Portugal in chronological order. In today's episode, we will begin the story of the future King Sancho I, the second king of Portugal, and, as is our tradition, we'll also give you some important background to his ascension to the throne. But before we start, I'd like to remind everyone that you can listen to all the episodes released so far via our website, kingsofhistory.buzzsprout.com. You can also follow us on social media so that you're always up to date when we release new episodes and many other things. So stop by and give us a like. If you are feeling generous and would like to contribute to the insurmountable amount of coffee that we need to keep our episodes fresh, then stop by our Patreon. Now, let's get down to business. The Almohads had occupied what was previously held by the Almoravids, and this sect was proven to be even more threatening. The period of consolidation of the Almohads on this side of the Strait of Gibraltar was doomed to take a very long time, and there were still strong pockets of resistance. One, for example, was led by the Wali of Silves, Ibn Qazi, who even considered subjugating himself to King Afonso Henriques in 1151, and, as a consequence, he was lynched by his own people. Another one, who lasted until 1172, was the so-called Wolf King of Murcia, Ibn Mardanis, who ruled for several years all the territory of the Al-Andalus that had not yet fallen to the Almohads, which included the current Spanish provinces of Murcia, Valencia, Alicante, and part of Albacete. During this period, which still lasted for quite some time, we have to bear in mind that the Almohad Empire was also extending its domains into present-day Algeria and Tunisia. The Iberian kingdoms were left in relative peace. Afonso Henriques would have used this time to organize new lands he had conquered, but he wouldn't say no regarding the conquest of new territories, particularly Alcácer do Sal, a very important city guarding the entrance to the Alentejo, an area that was essentially vacant at the time, apart from a few important cities here and there. This explains why it was so important for the Portuguese to conquer that city, since if we wanted to avoid this route, the road between the Tagus River and the next city that had any kind of importance, Évora, was inhospitable and empty of people, and therefore not very favorable to the progress of an army and the maintenance of a conquest. Imagine the situation from our king's point of view. Where would he gather his troops and all the logistics to be able to advance? There were only two realistic possibilities, Santarém and Lisbon. The rest of the north bank of the Tagus River was still underdeveloped and had sparsely populated territory, although the Templars were committed to this from 1158 onwards, when they repopulated the northern part of the riverbank. There was nothing in the vicinity on the opposite bank to support the conquest. Later, the construction of the castle of Coruche between Santarém and Montemoro Novo would fill part of this void. No wonder Alcácer do Sal was called the gateway to the Alentejo. On two occasions, King Afonso Henriques tried to conquer Alcácer, first around 1151 and later in 1157, but both attempts failed. Even so, the young kingdom breathed confidence. The king's invincible reputation was still felt, even among his Muslim enemies, and despite one setback or another, the situation in the Al-Andalus continued to invite conquest. Time seemed to be on the Portuguese side. From the day he was born, on the 11th of November 1154, Sancho, who at the time was still named Martinho, was destined for greatness under the auspices of a new and flourishing kingdom, although no one was sure about the dimensions this could achieve. Would it be in the church? After all, he was named after Saint Martin of Tours, the great Frankish saint and bishop, and Saint Martin of Doom, the missionary of the Suevi, godfather of their conversion to Catholicism and great promoter of Braga as the primate diocese of Hispania in the 6th century. Or perhaps in politics. Well, he had an older brother, Henrique, but he could still have been an important figure at this level. As we've already seen, Sancho was the 5th son of King Afonso Henriques and Queen Matilda of Savoy, and had an older brother, the heir to the throne, Henrique, who was already 7 years old. Portugal, the kingdom that saw little Martinho born, seemed to have a promising future. It's true that after the last conquests between 1147 and 1151, the Portuguese border stuck to the Tagus River and didn't move for almost 11 years, except for the Setúbal Peninsula where Sesimbra and Palmela had fallen shortly after the conquest of Lisbon. Well, at less than a year old, Martinho had his name changed. Quite possibly, this experience wasn't difficult for him or leave any marks, given his young age. But the reason that led to this change did last. It was probably 1155, and Henrique, his older brother, had died. The young man, who had been groomed from an early age to be the worthy successor to a new and thriving monarchy, was now a memory. Let's keep in mind that, at just 3 years old, Henrique had been appointed by his father, King Afonso Henriques, to represent him at an important council held in Toledo. King Afonso Henriques had now a total of 4 children. 3 daughters, Urraca, born probably in 1148, and future wife of King Ferdinand II of Leon, Teresa, born probably in 1151, the future Countess of Flanders and possible co-regent with her brother during the last years of their father's life. We'll talk about her a little bit later. Mafalda, born in 1153 and destined to be the wife of the future Alfonso II of Aragon, but unfortunately died in 1162, and Martinho, who was now Sancho. 2 more children were to be born. João, born in 1156, and in December of 1157, little Sancha, whose birth would dictate the death of her mother. So, widowed, with his kingdom threatened by 2 ambitious neighbors, and with only 2 male children, King Afonso Henriques set out on the final conquest of Alcácer, which opened the gates to the Alentejo. At this point, although it's still debated, it is likely that Sancho would have been entrusted to the care of the same Ribadouro family to which the Muniz belonged to, that had brought his father up. In Sancho's case, Egas Muniz's second wife and widow, Teresa Afonso, was his nanny. We can therefore assume that the young man would have been brought up in the family circle of the Ribadouro and the Sousa, 2 noble lineages who intermarried many times. But where? We don't know either, but it was probably in the countryside, around Coimbra and or in the areas where these families lived, in the mountains between Douro and Minho region. Much has been written about whether Sancho had learned to read or write, or whether he only knew how to read, or even if he really was a prodigious writer. Some historians point to the fact that there is no evidence to suggest that the king was literate, or, at most, semi-literate. That is, he probably only knew how to read. Others suggest that the king was the author of lyrical works and even some songs. Unfortunately, we cannot confirm or deny these claims, but what we can say is that in the second half of the 12th century, the paradigm of kingship had changed. Kings were no longer seen as military leaders with governing rights. They had to look after the well-being of their subjects, who were entrusted to them by the grace of God. In order to do this well, they had to be educated. Furthermore, the conceptualization of universities less than 100 years earlier began to revive Roman law and apply it to the fundamental laws of the countries, making the transition from the monarchies of custom and tradition to more centralized monarchies that were better able to manage the affairs of the people on the basis of law and legislation. It is therefore possible that Sancho had learned, among other things, at least to read. In 1158, everything changed. Alfonso VII, Emperor of Hispania, had died, and his successors, Ferdinand II in Leon and Sancho III in Castile, had signed the Treaty of Sahagún, as we've discussed in previous episodes. Two enormous concerns came to the fore for King Afonso Henriques. On the one hand, the treaty delimited each kingdom's areas of conquest, with Leon being responsible for conquering all the territory between the mouth of the Sado River and Niebla. In other words, it encompassed the area that Portugal saw as its natural area of conquest. But why is that? Because, and this would be our king's second concern, the brothers of Leon and Castile decided to reabsorb the new Portuguese kingdom into their domains, essentially annulling the effects of the Treaty of Zamora in 1143, where the late Alfonso VII recognized Portugal as a kingdom. As we saw in the introductory episodes, this project of the two brothers ended up falling apart because Sancho III of Castile died within months of signing the agreement, leaving a young Alfonso VIII on the throne at the mercy of Ferdinand II, his power-hungry uncle sitting on the neighboring throne. Now, according to Professor Violante Branco, it was these schemes in the courts of Leon and Castile that motivated King Afonso Henriques to return to expansionist politics, and this time he wouldn't let anything or anyone halt his progress. In the next 11 years, the advances were indeed remarkable. After Alcácer do Sal, conquered in 1158, Évora and Beja fell in 1159. But in 1161, they were lost again, due to the attacks of an Almohad army. Both were reconquered in the following years, but of these, only Évora remained permanently in Portuguese hands. At the age of 10, in 1164, Sancho returned to Coimbra, where he was given a house of his own, that is, a house with its steward and servants, chancellor, and other things necessary for managing the affairs of an infant, whether he was heir to the throne or not. By this time, he had already lost his mother. He was only 3 years old when this happened. His sister Mafalda died in 1162. His brother João died between 1163 and 1164, making Sancho the only legitimate male child of King Afonso Henriques. According to some sources, it was the death of his older brother Henrique that led the king to decide to house his son in Coimbra. But what did Sancho find when he arrived there? First of all, he found older and more experienced half-brothers, in particular Fernando, aged around 24, and Pedro, whose age cannot be ascertained, both illegitimate sons of King Afonso Henriques. Although the ideas of primogeniture, which meant that the king's eldest son inherited all his territories, and legitimacy were already more or less agreed upon by the main European monarchies, it was not certain how the future King of Portugal would occupy the throne. On the one hand, it should be remembered that Portugal saw itself as a kingdom descended from the Gothic monarchy that reigned in the peninsula, via Leon and Asturias. The Visigoth councils included a rule stipulating that the king had to be elected by an assembly of the greats of the kingdom, that is, nobles and clerics, even though in the following years these greats would simply elect the eldest son of the previous king. On the other hand, Pamplonian custom had determined that on the death of a king, his territories should be divided among his sons. Ferdinand the Great of Leon and Castile, Afonso Henriques' great-grandfather, was a Pamplonian by birth, and, as we have seen, he himself divided his kingdom among his 3 sons, giving each of his daughters a city and its lands. So, it wasn't that long ago that the Iberian kingdoms adopted very different ways of dealing with the succession of a king. Fernando and Pedro, the illegitimate sons of King Afonso Henriques, especially the former, who was older, having probably been born around 1140, had legitimate aspirations to be able to obtain something more than a funeral dirge at their father's death. But would that be the direction that Portugal would take? At just 12 years old, Sancho seems to have been given by his father the task of testing the defenses of Ciudad Rodrigo, a settlement built by Ferdinand II of Leon to garrison his border and extend his influence to the Ribacoa area. The Ribacoa region was a disputed territory, and it wasn't clear who it belonged to. It was located where we now call Beira Alta, around the border at the time with the Kingdom of Leon, which was not the same as it is today, but close. The foundation of Ciudad Rodrigo served as a point of expansion of the influence of the territory of Leon and was placed practically on the doorstep of our very young Kingdom of Portugal. This region of Ribacoa is the area more or less between the current border between Portugal and Spain, and the territories a few kilometers west of the River Coa. At the time, this whole region was disputed and it wasn't clear who it belonged to, and the foundation of Ciudad Rodrigo allowed Leon to expand its influence over this area, and later Alfonso IX, the successor to Ferdinand II, built a line of castles from north to south in order to define a clear border. We can still visit some of these castles today, or what remains of them, such as the castles of Castelo Rodrigo, Almeida, Castelo Bom, Vilar Maior, Alfaiates, and others in the region. We can imagine a line of castles from north to south between the city of Guarda and Ciudad Rodrigo. An amusing fact is that the city of Guarda has its name because it used to serve as a guard. This border situation was only settled with the Treaty of Alcañiz in 1297, but that's for when we talk about King Dinis. What we do know is that the campaign ended in defeat for the Portuguese side at the Battle of Arganal, possibly in 1167. Before that, King Afonso Henriques had even advanced as far as Salamanca, a city that welcomed him with open arms because it had taken a dim view of the foundation of Ciudad Rodrigo, which the King of Leon wanted to make a bishopric by any means possible, thus taking territory and wealth away from Salamanca. In fact, the relationship between Leon and Portugal had been in dire straits since the death of Emperor Alfonso VII, and open conflict between them had existed since at least 1162-63. During these years, King Afonso Henriques once again conquered the counties of Limia and Toronho, with the important episcopal city of Tui at the top of this small but important political pyramid, and made several threats to Ciudad Rodrigo, although without much to show for. In 1165, the two kings decided to make peace through the Treaty of Pontevedra. In this treaty, no territory was returned and the Portuguese remained with their conquests in Galicia. What was agreed was the marriage of Urraca Afonso, the Portuguese king's eldest daughter, to Ferdinand II. This marriage was destined to go as well as this peace agreement, and ended up being annulled by the papal legate in Hispania a few years later. It's possible that Sancho at least witnessed or was privy to the preparations for the campaigns that took place around this time, including his possible but debatable participation in the campaign that ended in defeat at Arganal, near the city of Ciudad Rodrigo. But we can't say for sure because sources are surprisingly silent about the future king's warlike activity until he shows up already at 24 years old in all his splendor in front of Seville in 1178. In other words, it wouldn't be of much interest to national records to have entries about the failures of the heir to the throne, but they certainly existed. In previous episodes, we talked a little about Geraldo, the Fearless, a legendary character nicknamed the Portuguese Cid, who conquered a large part of the Alentejo region in the following years, especially between 1165 and 1169, in actions that barely disguised the main target, Badajoz. In 1167, as we have seen, the city was practically surrounded by Portuguese territory, but it still resisted. It was perhaps this situation that motivated Ferdinand II to ally himself with the Almohads in 1168. We have now reached the turning point in Portuguese history during this first reign. In 1169, the tragedy of Badajoz took place, and Portugal's fortunes suddenly took on a more greyish hue. Previously, the Portuguese advance had been quite impressive, even compared to what the other peninsular kingdoms had achieved, which was very little. And as a result of this defeat, it seemed that Portugal was retreating just as quickly as it was advancing. In our opinion, there are three reasons for this: circumstantial, economic, and geologistical. As for the circumstantial reasons, we've already discussed them in the episodes contextualizing the period. The Almohads spent a few decades putting their house in order, but as the 70s of the 12th century approached, they became stronger and stronger and more capable of thwarting the ambitions of King Afonso Henriques. As for the economic reasons, we also mentioned in episode 2 of the King Afonso Henriques series that a large part of the border economy was based on the raids and depredations that these settlements achieved on the other side. For a king like Afonso Henriques, who had spent years consolidating the new territories gained between the Mondego River and the Tagus River, and was now committed to turning that river into a defense line, we can see this in the donations he had made to the Knights Templar alongside the right bank of that river, and the effort they made to fortify those territories. It might not have mattered as much as we think to conquer so much territory that pushed the border too far south. And from an economic point of view, it was much more profitable to have enemy territory nearby to plunder and from which to collect ransoms than to actually conquer it, occupy it, and have to spend resources that the country didn't have to develop it and integrate it into the existing mosaic. This brings us to the end of this episode, which is the starting point for the life and reign of King Sancho I, the second King of Portugal. We can see that the beginning of Sancho's story and the end of the story of his father, King Afonso Henriques, go hand in hand, and as the historian Matoso said, 2 kings, 1 kingship. Don't miss the next episode, where we will continue this journey through time, where we will see Sancho knighted, and finally learn a little about what the now called Spaniards said when Afonso Henriques was held in captivity. We will see you in the next episode. Take care, kings and queens.